My initial feeling when I was asked to speak on this subject was that I did not feel adequate to be doing it, to be honest. Partly because of the broadness of the subject. There's a book right here that in a sense answers the question that we're asking. Was our country founded upon Christian principles and a Christian foundation? And a whole book. And I thought about how long it would take to read this book, and didn't think that y'all would want to stick around that long. But it's a really great book, Defending the Declaration by Gary Amos. And he does a good job of really approaching it, but it's kind of dated. It was written a couple of decades ago, and so we've kind of encountered some other things since then. But really, is it a different thing, or is it the same thing, just kind of changed a little bit? It kind of morphs. Historic revisionism is an interesting term. You revision at history in a different way than one's looked at it before, but there's usually a negative connotation put towards it because it usually is cast in the light of really a kind of iconoclast type of mentality, where you want to destroy these structures that have been built in the past and erect something different that is more accurate, supposedly, and better for us. And that's the kind of how it's put. Most of the time, however, revisionism, historic revisionism is, it tends to be kind of innovative, and they try to sell books. They try to gain some popularity, and so it's often, if not always, wrong. But that's what really kind of fascinated me with history. It was when I first got started here at Valdosta State, and just the notion that some people would challenge the past was interesting to me. And then the notion that you could defend those type of things was interesting to me. And so that's kind of what really got me involved in it. I love history now, and I love studying it for what it is. And I appreciate Fraser's comment that, history is what history is. But our interpretation of it can sometimes be skewed a little bit if we're not careful. And how can it be skewed? That's kind of what we're here to talk about. Every part of American history has suffered from those who seek to impose their political, psychological, or philosophical worldview on challenging the traditional understanding of the foundations of our past. Some may ask why it's important. Why do we even care about this type of thing? Why is it important to have these discussions? When you examine the history of thought, however, you're immediately struck by the fact that, like R.C. Sproul kind of coined in the book that he wrote, ideas have consequences. And the ideas of Marx, Freud, and Kinsey have filtered down to us in interpretations of history from writers of history books, shapers of school curriculum, so that I've been taught a lot of things that I'm like, I need to go check on that, right? Go check the primary resources. Go check some other historians to see what they have to say. I always tell the students in my history classes that you need to have at least 2 history books, and you need to make sure that both of them, that they're from different perspectives. You want to know what the other perspective is. If you have a perspective and you follow someone, get that one and follow it. I have several history books I really like. Johnson, Sweikart and Allen, and Kidd, and a bunch of different ones I like. But I like reading a bunch of the ones. I have ones that I won't say dislike. I like them, and I like to use them because I pick on them all the time. And there's several of them that I use in my notes. My history lecture notes that I make available for my students actually contain more quotes from people I disagree with and people I agree with, which is interestingly enough. And in class, it generates a discussion, and we have a good time with it. But modern day scholars and celebrities and internet personalities utilize a lot of these historical revisionism, this historical revisionism to chip away at the foundations of traditional understanding of history, imposing their own worldview under the guise of an academic discipline that should be known for objectivity. And history is kind of one of those things. You get the impression if you get a history book, history doesn't change, it's the same for everything, so you just get the impression that when I pick it up, it's going to have that, but it doesn't. Every history book I've ever read has an interpretation in it. And you have to know how to catch those things. A lot of these revisionist ideas are used to bolster the claims of things like critical race theory. Now, that's why books like this are kind of outdated a little bit, because he doesn't use that term. He doesn't know what that term is. I didn't see it in the book, critical race theory, CRT. Several years ago, this idea was used in, or it was brought up in the Southern Baptist Convention to use CRT, critical race theory, as a tool in seminaries to help do things. I always thought it's very odd. Now, and I'm in a safe crowd, I think, but what's interesting to me, most of the time, when you see socialism work in the 20th century, they do so in a very kind of covert way. They infiltrate in a very kind of just, sneaky. Some people might call it sneaky, but it's just very methodical, and they've done that in our educational system very effectively. And the very fact that they would bring that up in the Southern Baptist Convention, which I thought was very out of character for that type of mentality, because they didn't need to mention it at all. If they had never had mentioned it, it wouldn't have been on 90% of the people's radar, and it would have still been there, because it's there now. And it's in our seminaries, it's all in colleges and universities, and so it's not just that you can feel like, well, I can go to a Christian seminary or a Southern Baptist seminary, or I can go to some other Christian school and I won't get that. No, it's there. It's the interpretations are there, and from this. Now, what is critical race theory? Well, it's a tool that's used to interpret history as a movement, essentially, that history is basically moved by oppressor against the oppressed. And you can follow history in that vein. Now, well, actually, that's not an old theory, that's not a new theory. Marxism kind of looks at it that way. It very much looks at it that way. And Marxism looks at it more of a worker type of thing, and it doesn't have race involved in it. But critical race theory kind of brings in the same mentality, but looking at it from a slightly different lens. And if you're familiar with Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States, he kind of comes at it from a Marxist standpoint of interpreting history through that lens of worker, the hard worker, us, the poor, the people who struggle against those who are the rich who control everything else and everything. And if you read Zinn, you'll see that just about on every single page and the like. And critical race theory and some of the things that's been published since then is like the 1619 Project, books related to that kind of see that want to write history books or convey history in light of, hey, the origins of their situation are in fact based on oppression, not on heroism, not on bravery, not on courage. It's based on the fact of that time. And you see that, how they interpret different parts of history. And so one of the big targets of whether it be just plain out Marxism, critical race theory, or anything. One of the big targets in the crosshairs of such revisionists is Christianity's influence on the founding of our country. I recently heard one celebrity dismiss the notion, and this is I'm going to give you a couple examples of how it's just kind of, like it's on Facebook. It's on Facebook, it's in journal articles and things like that. I recently heard a celebrity on Facebook, just a little clip from his show, dismiss the notion of Christianity's influence on the founding of our country by saying that the founding fathers were deists who got their morality from the Enlightenment. And just completely floored this, what I end up finding out was a new Christian who was very excited. He said, man, have you seen the stuff about all through the founding of our country, all throughout history of the last 2,000 years of what Christianity's done and what it was able to do in the United States? And he said, he just dismissed all of it, the guy that he was talking to, by saying that, oh, well, the founding fathers were deists. They were deists, and they got their morality from the Enlightenment. Now, that's one example. In a preview for the upcoming documentary by Ken Burns, which I love to watch Ken Burns documentaries, by the way. But like with all Ken Burns, with every secondary resource, a primary resource is something like They Said It, right? The actual letters that Thomas Jefferson wrote, the original documents of the founding of our country and all that. But secondary resources are like history books, and they're like documentaries and things. And Ken Burns has some great documentaries. I love to watch them. But like with all documentaries and all secondary resources, you have to listen very carefully at what's going on. And one of the things, on this upcoming one, they were advertising it, and they do this blurb of, about 3 minutes about telling you what's coming up and kind of tweaking your curiosity about things. It says, one of the commentators says, we think of the revolution as a war against empire, but it very quickly becomes a war for empire. Now, on the one hand, that might not even be on anybody's radar. That might just be, just like, well, who cares about that comment? That's just, a pretty cool comment and all that stuff. Empire, woo! Darth Vader, all right, yay! And of course, it's anachronistic if you start thinking about it like that, but that's not what goes on. They're talking about the idea of empire in a negative way. How that's why the guys for the American Revolution ultimately gained it, because they wanted to keep their money and they wanted to expand their territory to and keep their money. And so basically our country was founded on that kind of principle, oppressors against the oppressed. And they will milk that towards going towards anti-labor, anti-civil rights. They will milk it and say they promoted slavery, all this other kind of stuff. And so you watch it. For those little comments, you just recognize right off, these people are going to try to push this agenda. And they may not push it all the way, and there may be a lot of interesting stuff and good stuff in the Ken Burns thing, but maybe not. But anyway, there's another documentary that the History Channel put out about 20 years ago. It's called Founding Fathers. And I like it. It has a lot of really good stuff in it, but it also has some stuff you got to watch. For instance, one of the historians in the documentary equates the American fight for independence with Vladimir Lenin's takeover of Russia. Now, and he does that in a complimentary way. All right? That's how deceptive it is. He said, oh, this is one of the great epochs in history, the American Revolution, the takeover of Russia by Vladimir Lenin, and it just kind of moves on, just says it in passing. And I'm sitting here, and I show this documentary in my class, and I stop it, and I say, boom, did y'all catch that? Did y'all catch that? We have to think critically. We have to read critically. And we have to listen critically when it comes to these documentaries. To equate what went on and the founding of our country with what Vladimir Lenin and consequently Joseph Stalin did in Russia is a vast mischaracterization, a terrible comparison when it comes down to it. But a lot of it is the fruit of this effort to say that the United States was not founded on Christianity. Because no one would ever accuse Vladimir Lenin of saying that, or of starting a revolution on the basis of Christianity. I mean, that would be, somebody would be crazy to try to do that. That would be academic suicide. But to come at it from the other direction and say that the United States wasn't, that's a little different. It's a little further away in history. And the further away you get in history, and when you deal with people and that may not be as familiar with a lot of the things, if you cherry pick some of the things out of history, it makes you sound smart. And like that new Christian who was talking to the guy that was interviewing him, when he came across that, he wasn't prepared for that type of thing. He didn't know how to answer it. And he just kind of said, yeah, man, that, whatever. But anyway, Jesus is great. I mean, he was just on fire, and I felt kind of sorry for him. But again, it kind of chipped away a little bit at his understanding of the heritage that he had been in. It discouraged him somewhat. And how many people are discouraged? How many young people come into college on fire for the Lord as they've been raised in a Christian home, but they're put in a setting where every class they go in, science and sociology and history, everybody's chipping away at the foundations a little bit. And there's the danger here. This is the danger. This is the danger. And all of these kind of chip away at the foundation of what we thought about America's founding, replacing it with a view that fits the narrative of those who want to negate the influence of Christianity. Now, there are a few things that I watch out for in textbooks, and it's a little bit more complicated than the way I'm going to give it, but I tried to reduce it to basically 4 or 5 things. When I look at textbooks, biographies, documentaries, and things like this, secondary resources, essentially, I look for, number one, is the author imposing a worldview on the individual, group, or movement in history that he's doing, okay? For instance, like that guy that equated the American Revolution with Vladimir Lenin's deal. I mean, this is one thing we kind of have to remember. During this time period, they knew nothing about Jehovah's Witnesses. They knew nothing about Mormons. They knew nothing about the charismatic movement. They knew nothing about socialism. They knew nothing about Marxism. They knew nothing about all this. This is before all of that kind of stuff that we know at least a little bit of. We've heard about it. They didn't know anything about it. But this author, this so-called historian, and I use that with every sense of the word, so-called historian, when he says that the American Revolution was like, when he equates them like that, that's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous, and it shoots up a red flag. So, is he imposing a worldview on a individual, a group, or a movement, or something like that? You want to watch out for that. Is the author generalizing? Is he generalizing? Like that author, like that celebrity did with that young Christian guy. He said they were all deists. They were all deists. And of course, that's a fallacy. That's a very fallacious way of trying to win an argument, because it's called hasty generalization. And really, it just kind of said, when you look at the situation, you can pick out a handful of people who would have bought into what you would have called deism. But to say that they were all deists has no foundation whatsoever in this. And I'm going to show you that even the ones that you could call deists, all right, I'm getting ahead of myself. Y'all, that's going to get good. Y'all thought this history thing was boring. All right. Number 3 is the author cherry picking. A lot of times they'll make quotes, and let me say this. there's a lot that these guys wrote. You look at the Federalist Papers, you look at the letters that they wrote to one another, the correspondence between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson is tremendous. And but the Federalist Papers, the minutes that were recorded in the constitutional conventions, the minutes that were recorded in the early meetings that went on leading up to the Revolution, all these different things. You've got all these different quotes, and a lot of people would get mad. And they'd say things and exaggerate their point a little bit. And I mean, there's all these different things that you kind of have to take into account. And a lot of them will take these little snippets and they'll lift it out of the context of what they're saying and the context of the time, and they'll apply it to a modern day understanding of what went on. One of the ways that they do this in the cherry picking is that they quote a lot of the founding fathers because those particular quotes sound like natural theology. Now, natural theology is the theology and the belief of God on the basis of nature and the things that we see in the creation. And the book of Romans talks about that type of thing. Psalm 19 talks about that thing. The heavens declare the glory of God. So there's some things that we can see in the creation that tell us about the great God of this universe. And in fact, it's effective. It's effective for what God wants. It leaves people, Romans chapter 1, without excuse. But natural theology doesn't take us to the point that revealed theology does, that special revelation does. Special revelation, God's Word, brings to us the power of the gospel, doesn't it? And that's where we have the wonderful teachings of the development in types and shadows of the gospel in the Old Testament through the covenant of grace that's developed all throughout the Bible. And then ultimately in the New Testament, we see it in its fruition in the Gospels and the flowering in the book of Acts. And the beauty of it that's elucidated in the writings of Paul and John and Peter and Jude and so forth. I mean, the special revelation is good. But so you've got this natural theology, however, and the reason that they quote these and cherry pick those quotes is because it fits their narrative that all of them relied not upon the ethics and theology of the Bible, but the ethics and the theology of the Enlightenment and deism. Because the Enlightenment and deism normally didn't have a problem with natural theology necessarily. And so how do you answer those questions? Because it sounds like we can get in the weeds, y'all. It's good stuff. All right. So that's cherry picking. You got to watch if they're cherry picking. Related to that is he ignoring other influence? They're cherry picking not necessarily just quotes, but they're also cherry picking things. Like he just says, the only influences on the founding fathers were the Enlightenment and deism, and they have quotes from these guys that reflect a naturalist theology. And they say, see, that's the only influence that they have. They don't take into account the Reformation. They don't take into account Puritanism. They don't take into account the Great Awakening. They don't take into account the revivals within certain denominations, like the Baptists and the Presbyterians particularly during this time frame. And they don't see, they cherry pick not only the quotes for a particular reason, like I said, but they also cherry pick those movements that may have had influence on them, and they just focus on that. Then they may mention, to be fair, some of them mention everything. Oh yeah, and by the way, there was the Reformation, but no one's quoting those guys and all that stuff. So how do you answer that? And lastly, is he defining terms correctly? And here it's kind of interesting, and I think it's a little deceptive a little bit because the term deism is used a lot. And deism is often associated with that famous demonstration of, hey, what is deism? Deism basically sees God as a clockmaker. And he, as a clockmaker, creates a great clock. Like the universe is a great, intricate, detailed, all these wonderful things. Natural theology, we could see it. Isn't God great? But like a clockmaker, God is the best clockmaker, and He set it up, and He wound it up, and He walks away from it, and you never have to deal with it anymore. So you may have heard the idea of, God kind of meets us halfway. God did all this stuff for you. Now He expects you to do all of this. And a lot of that is kind of from that deistic outlook on life and stuff. Now, so that's how they look at deism. But a lot of times they'll look at deism as not Christian. Okay, when they define, it's not enough that you define the term correctly. I just want to tell you that. You have to know how they are using the term also. And many times the people who are trying to undercut the foundations of our country in regards to Christianity define deism as just, if a person said they were a deist, they are not Christian at all, that type of thing. They are completely devoid of any of that type of thing. And so how does this all flesh out? Well, these questions led me to the following conclusions in regards to our particular subject matter. Okay, regarding the deism enlightenment view, that it was the major impact and influence on the founding fathers. To support their view, they usually quote Jefferson, Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. John Adams a little less. John Adams was a big proponent and wrote a lot about the influence of the ethics of the Bible, the ethics of Christianity, and how important it was. And so they kind of avoid him a little bit, but they do every now and then say, "Oh, well, John Adams didn't believe in the deity of Christ," or stuff like that, and that was a deistic influence, and so but Franklin and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson are usually the ones they focus on. And again, they'll cherry pick. They'll say, well, see what they did here, what they did here, and they'll define it in such a way that it's not Christianity, right? And if you know that, and if you're ever debating someone, that's what you want to do. You want them to define it, and in a sense, you want them to define it wrong, and because they do, and then you come up and you say, well, that's just not what the history bears out. In fact, these men had, particularly Franklin and Jefferson, you can see in their biographies some development at certain times in their lives. They were more apt to certain things than others. Does that make sense? Like a lot of people. And when they had more time on their hands and they had more time to be, retrospective about things, they tended to fly off the handle, like a lot of philosophers tend to do. And now I'm not saying these guys were Christians in the sense that we would say, hey, come join our church. Franklin, Adams, John Quincy Adams, his son, Thomas Jefferson, they would all be brought before a good theological board and waylaid. Certainly. But let me say this. Their influence was tremendous in regards to the founding of our country. But their influence was not a non-Christian deism at all. It was not that at all. Like I say, while I admit these men were not Christians in the traditional sense coming down from the Puritans, I will also say they were not very good deists either. They were not good deists. I mean, think about it. Thomas Jefferson. Now, this is an article. By the way, I had like 12 or 13 articles and books and articles and things like that. I made copies, so it looks like I don't have much, but I rather than the cumbersome that my wife would have to carry all the way from the car, I decided to make copies and do all this number here. One day I will be like Clint and I will have it all on an iPad, and it's so much easier, so much easier. And I did want to say, by the way, a lot of the wording that I use is I consciously am piggybacking off of some of what Clint said in the last meeting as I'm kind of building up. I want you to be able to come to this meeting if you could without having to go to Clint. But if you did, I wanted you to see that there would be a development. So I use terms like worldview. I use that kind of thing a little bit throughout this speech because I thought Clint did a great job. And but anyway, Thomas Jefferson and this secular icon for a lot of people. Hey, he's the man, right? We look into him. While a member of the House of Burgesses in 1774. Now, this is right after when the Boston Tea Party. Right after the Boston Tea Party, England lays the hammer down on Boston and takes away a lot of their rights. And they have all these different things, and then a lot of meetings ensue where what are we going to do as a country because of what they're doing, and then there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of letters written, a lot of all this kind of stuff. But one of the things that was done was that Thomas Jefferson, a member of the House of Burgesses in 1774, called for a day of prayer in response to the effort of the British to close Boston Harbor after the infamous Boston Tea Party. This is how Jefferson's resolution read. This House, being deeply impressed with apprehension, deem it highly necessary, and I bold that, it was highly necessary that the said first day of June be set apart by members of the House as a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, devoutly to implore the divine interposition. That's a fancy term for God. We want to implore God. The great clockmaker who walked away and doesn't do anything, we want to pray to Him that He would bless us. This is not what a deist would do, right? That we would implore Him, God, for averting the heavy calamity which threatens destruction on our civil rights. Ordered, therefore, the House of Burgesses orders, therefore, that members of this House do attend with the Speaker and the mace to the church in this city. This is Thomas Jefferson. Y'all boys need to go to church for the purposes aforesaid. Not only do we have a day of prayer, I don't want you to do it at your homes. I want you to meet in the church and do it. And that the Reverend Mr. Price be appointed to read prayers and the Reverend Mr. Guatkin to preach a sermon. Y'all going to pray, you're going to fast, and you're going to listen to a sermon so that we would please the God of this universe. Noted, this was ordered, not simply recommended or urged, and it was the actual legislators themselves, every one of them who went to church to participate in this day of prayer. This wasn't just for the churches or the preachers or the people in the pews. No, the lawmakers themselves sensed the urgency of pleading with God for His favor and intervention. That is not how deists would think. They also like to pick on George Washington. Now, George Washington was no theologian. And many people point to George Washington's affinity with wanting to be involved in world affairs and be seen as, I know what I'm talking about when I'm, with the stuff going on in France, the stuff going on and all this kind of stuff. And sometimes they like to point out that he was a deist as well. George Washington participated in this day of prayer, writing in his diary, went to church, fasted all day. Now, I love that. George Washington went to church, fasted all day. You ever thought about the fact, I've always been encouraged to write a journal, and everybody has I'm sure heard that before in their life. I've never gotten to the habit of it, unfortunately. I feel like I should, and I feel like that's one of the downfalls of myself. Not downfall, but one of the things that I should have taken care of. But I always intimidated, I was always intimidated by writing a journal because I feel like I got to write all this stuff. No, George Washington that day went to church, fasted all day. Now, how do you interpret that in a deistic framework? You don't, do you? You really don't. It doesn't make any sense at all. So that's Thomas Jefferson, right? We can take him off of the list of deists and influence of the country. What about Benjamin Franklin? Now that was right before the Revolution, 2 years before the Revolution, the American independence, the beginning of it. When this is after this, the war's over, we have gained our independence, we're writing the Constitution. They're meeting, many meetings to gather together for this Constitution. When after the representatives who had met in 1787 to write the Constitution of the United States struggled for several weeks, making little or no progress, 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin rose and addressed the troubled and disagreeing convention that was about to adjourn in confusion. So what does a deist tell these people that we need to do to get things on track? It seemed that their attempt to form a lasting union had apparently failed. Benjamin Franklin got up and he said this: "In the beginning of the contest with Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayers in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of the superintending providence in our favor." In other words, it wasn't a clockmaker who walked away. He was with us. "And have we now forgotten this powerful friend? Or do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time," he's speaking to the speaker, "and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, it is probable that an empire can rise without his. Is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings," that's the Bible, "that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it." These are the words of Benjamin Franklin. I firmly believe this. That is not what a deist would say. "I also believe," Benjamin Franklin goes on, "that without his concurring aid, continuous, onward in our country, that we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial local interests. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. And what is worth, mankind may hereafter, from this unfortunate instance, despair of establishing a government by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, or conquest. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberation be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business." A Baptist preacher could not have said it better. Thank you, Benjamin Franklin. All right, so Benjamin Franklin's off the list, right? John Adams. Now, this is later in John Adams' life. This is in his correspondence with Thomas Jefferson. The election of 1800, him and Thomas Jefferson kind of got at odds with one another, and they split up and weren't friends for a long time. But Benjamin Rush was actually instrumental in bringing them together, and they ended up having a correspondence with one another until both of their deaths on July the 4th, 1826, 50 years exactly after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Both of them died on that day. They were in kind of a little competition with one another. John Adams dies, and his last words are, "Jefferson still remains." And But he didn't know that Jefferson had died earlier that day. But both of them died on that day, July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the celebration, after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But very interesting. I say this for a couple of reasons. This is what he said in his, this is a letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1813. And this is just a portion of it. He says, "Now I will avow that I then believed and now believe that those general principles of Christianity are as eternal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God, and that those principles of liberty are as unalterable as human nature and our terrestrial mundane system. I could therefore safely say, consistently with all my then and present information, that I believed that they would never make discoveries in contradiction to these general principles." In other words, the things of the Bible are true. I believe them. They are as firm as the very universe in which we live. And I don't think that anything anybody ever does is going to change that. Basically what he said. "In favor of these general principles in philosophy, religion, and government, I could fill sheets of quotations from Frederick of Prussia, from Hume, Gibbon, Bolingbroke, Rousseau, and Voltaire, as well as Newton and Locke, not to mention thousands of divines and philosophers of inferior fame." Now, even Adams recognized that these famous philosophers, in order for them to make sense of their life, if you read that paragraph very carefully, and this is kind of piggybacking off of some of what he said, Clint said last time, even Adams recognized that in order for their philosophies to make any sense whatsoever, Hume, Locke, all these different guys that he a lot of these are atheists, not Locke, but Voltaire, Rousseau, they had to borrow from the Christian worldview in order for their stuff to make any sense. That is a theme in a lot of the writings of the Founding Fathers, by the way. I'll show you that in a couple of minutes with someone else. But John Adams recognized that. He said that it's so, the philosophy of Christianity based upon the Bible is so foundational that even its enemies have to borrow from it in order to make their philosophy to make sense at all. It's quite fascinating. So these are the deists, and I think we've kind of did all that I could do there. This is just to say that even the big deists had to borrow from the Christian worldview repeatedly throughout their lives, and in fact seemed to believe something other than pure deism in regards to the founding of our country. The foundations of our country was not based upon an Enlightenment deistic complete deism that was completely devoid of Christianity. It was based on, according to the people who were there, who are the ones that atheists today refer to, it was based on Christianity. Wholly and completely. Now that's just those deist guys. There's another one, Thomas Paine. Now, a lot of he's a favorite of modern revisionists because of his atheistic statements from his work called The Age of Reason. Now, the reason they want Paine on their side is because of the pamphlet that he wrote, Common Sense, which was written in January and published in January of 1776 and had such a tremendous influence on getting the grassroots of America on the side of independence. I mean, it was huge. And they say, well, if the guy that did that was a deist or an atheist, then that means that the foundations of America are based on that, not Christianity. Okay? So how do we approach that? Because I can't deny that Thomas Paine said some stupid stuff in his life. I mean, come on. But a lot of people, I'll get to this in a minute, but a lot of people who read his stuff thought it was stupid stuff. Like Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry said, I've read Thomas Paine. He's no different than these other guys. And these other guys were proven wrong. So what makes him think that his nonsense is going to be right if we prove those other guys wrong? But anyway, I got a theory about that. What's important to note is that Thomas Paine never disparages religion in that book, in that pamphlet, Common Sense. It's like 76 pages long, a pamphlet, okay? He never disparages religion when he writes it in that little book. In fact, he makes many biblical allusions and practical quotes favorably using the Christian worldview to make his case. Also, one author points out that Benjamin Rush helped Paine with Common Sense. Some of you are going, what? Benjamin Rush? He's my hero. Many of you may not have ever heard. I was looking over my textbooks in my office, and I've got 20 textbooks or something like this. And some of them don't even mention Benjamin Rush. Some of them may have one reference to Benjamin Rush without explaining who he is, and just like he didn't even exist. But Benjamin Rush was a pretty important guy. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. In fact, his name is right above Benjamin Franklin's name. Not that that means anything, but other than that, he signed the Declaration of Independence, right? At the time of his death, I'm reading from a biography here that sums up things. At the time of Benjamin Rush's death in 1813, newspapers, founding fathers, and other leaders of the day heralded Benjamin Rush as one of America's 3 most notable individuals, ranking him with George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. The esteem that Benjamin Rush achieved was rightly deserved as a result of his numerous accomplishments. He offered 4 decades of political service to his country. He was such an accomplished medical doctor, that he had been titled the father of American medicine. He helped establish at least 5 universities, colleges, or academies. He formulated visionary educational policies and authored numerous textbooks. He pioneered educational opportunities for both women and black Americans, and he helped found and guide numerous societies to end slavery, to promote science, to encourage Sunday schools, and to promote Bibles, and to provide relief for the insane, and so forth. Tremendously great founding father. Dr. Rush's abilities were both broad and productive. As a statesman, his leadership was invaluable. As a physician, his discoveries benefited all of humanity. As a philanthropist, his generosity was unparalleled. As a reformer, his efforts were tireless. As a Christian, his zeal for the propagation of his faith was unrivaled. Considering his influence on America, it is past time to resurrect the account of his life. But that's probably why, because of his such a bold stance on Christianity and his bold stance on the need to print Bibles and have them in schools, he's actually called, and time's getting away from me, so I don't have time to read all this stuff. I told Clint, I said, you give me too much time. And David, I said, you gave me too much time, I got too much information. He's called the father of the modern public education. And now lest that really turn everybody off. His goal in public education was to make sure that the Bible served as curriculum that covered the whole gamut of education. And he had a society for printing Bibles that he was promoting. He called on the Congress to actually encourage the printing. I mean, he's a fascinating individual. He really, really is. He was born to Quaker parents, John and Susanna Rush. When the subject of American independence began to be agitated in conversation. Now, this is where this comes in with Thomas Paine and Common Sense. There were apparently Thomas Paine was having some difficulty and stuff. And so this is what Benjamin Rush writes. This is quoting Benjamin Rush. When the subject of American independence began to be agitated in conversation, I observed the public mind to be loaded with an immense mass of prejudice and error relative to it. At this time, I called upon Mr. Paine and suggested to him the propriety of preparing our citizens for a perpetual separation of our country from Great Britain. He seized the idea with avidity and immediately began his famous pamphlet in favor of that measure. He read the sheets to me at my house as he composed them. And when he had finished them, I advised him to put them in the hands of Dr. Franklin, Samuel Adams, and the late Judge James Wilson, assuring him at the same time that they all held the same opinions that he defended. A title only was warranted for this pamphlet before it was committed to press. Mr. Payne proposed it, call it Plain Truth. I objected to it and suggested the title Common Sense. This was instantly adopted, and Common Sense burst from the press in a few days. So, not to take anything away from Thomas Paine and the wonderful pamphlet that he produced and everything, but to take away the influence of Benjamin Rush, this tremendous Christian man, is a tremendous oversight. But again, it's a part of the cherry picking that's done in a lot of history textbooks. None of the textbooks that I've ever read ever say that Benjamin Rush had an influence on Thomas Paine's writing of Common Sense. And there's a reason for that, isn't it? There's a reason for that. It doesn't fit the narrative. It doesn't fit the narrative. I mean, think about it. Think about these guys. So while they like to quote these guys, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, and John Adams, and Thomas Paine, they selectively quote them to fit their narrative. They seem to avoid altogether those other influential men who embraced and sought to live out Christianity. And while the Enlightenment and Age of Reason were impactful, no doubt, a case can be made that other influences were more so. Puritanism and the Great Awakening transformed the grassroots of America, and some of this comes from a textbook. It's a 2-volume textbook by Thomas Kidd, Kidd, which I highly recommend. It's a great textbook. It's very recent also. But he said, Puritanism, the Great Awakening, transformed the grassroots of America, particularly bolstering the Baptist, Presbyterian, and Methodist faiths. The particular Baptist, John Leland, worked to ensure that the Constitution include a Bill of Rights, and Madison did not submit it until he passed it through the hands of John Leland, the particular Baptist. Particular Baptist is another way of saying Reformed Baptist back then, or Calvinist Baptist. The Presbyterian John Witherspoon would exert tremendous influence from his pulpit through his tenure as president of Princeton. John Witherspoon, born in Scotland, educated in Edinburgh, was a leading Presbyterian, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, another one, by the way, a member of the Continental Congress. He came to America in 1768 to become president of Princeton College, which was founded in 1746, was originally named the College of New Jersey. He was well respected as an educator, taught many students who would go on to become influential judges and legislators, including James Madison. He's had a tremendous influence on a lot of people that was felt decades afterwards. In 1776, he preached a divisive sermon called The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men. That's a very Calvinistic title, you know. That's pretty cool. As Witherspoon declared in his 1776 sermon, I willingly embrace the opportunity of declaring my opinion without any hesitation that the cause in which America is now in arms is the cause of justice, of liberty, and of human nature. In addition to this, Witherspoon's position on the doctrine of original sin was important in forming the government of the United States. First, the reality of an embedded sin nature meant that every individual was prone to misuse power. And I could expand on that. Secondly, the concept of federalism, federal headship, is also at the heart of the doctrine of original sin. The sin of Adam, humanity's representative head, doomed humanity and everyone proceeding from him according to the Christian religion. Adam's failure, not John Adams, I'm talking about the original Adam. Adam's failure as our federal head was passed on to humanity. In him we all sinned, is what Romans 5 says. Accordingly, the solution to the problem of sin and evil is to be found in the voluntary atonement of Christ, humanity's second representative, the second Adam. Since many of our founders embraced the Christian religion or were at least impacted by it, this federalism became firmly fixed in the nature of government that was instituted in the United States. The idea that people can be represented by another is foundational to America's form of government. It's also very Presbyterian at its core, and you see John Witherspoon kind of at the head of that type of thing. A man who holds to this doctrine of sin and federal headship is very different than what a deist would ever say about deism was, and in the Enlightenment was famous for saying that people are a product of their environment, and that is the only thing that was ultimately the reason behind any kind of thing we might call sin or something. And people like Hume and other people would even question whether we could even call it sin or anything ethical and the like. But men like John Witherspoon were very different, weren't they? Very different and very Christian in their thing. Patrick Henry, he was also a Presbyterian. Patrick Henry, I got two quotes I want to say from him. He's remembered for the saying, "Give me liberty or give me death," right? But this is what he said. He said, it cannot be emphasized. By the way, where this is said is also very important. This is 1765, around the time of the initial overreach of the British government in regards to taxation without representation. And this is what he addresses the Virginia House of Burgesses. He says, "It cannot be emphasized too clearly and too often that this nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians. Not on religion, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. For this very reason, peoples of other faiths have been afforded asylum, prosperity, and freedom for worship here." He said the reason other people from other faiths have freedom at all is because we are Christian. Which lends to the idea that living in a country that has not been founded on Christian principles brings up the possibility very much so that you won't have those freedoms. And we see that in our world even to this day. But this is Patrick Henry. Our nation was founded on Christianity. Boom. All right. Now, this is in that textbook by Thomas Kidd. Really great textbook. But this is what he says. Some people accused him of being a deist. Okay? Slander, right? I'm almost finished, by the way. Slanderous. Said, he hated that. He said, "Call me a deist? Who do these people think they are?" Anyway, he said, he's writing to his to Betsy, his niece, I think, or so, relative of some type. He said, "The view which the rising greatness of our country presents to my eyes is greatly tarnished by the general prevalence of deism, which with me is but another name for vice and depravity." He said, "I am, however, much consoled by reflecting that the religion of Christ has, from its first appearance in the world, been attacked in vain by all the wits, philosophers, and wise ones, aided by every power of man, and its triumph has been complete." Christianity's triumph has been complete over all these other crazies. What is there in the wit or wisdom of the present deistical writers or professors that can compare them with Hume, Shaftesbury, Bolingbroke, and others? In other words, all these other guys who tried to knock Christianity off the map. And Hume, by the way, was still living. He died in 1776, interestingly enough. Hume did. And Patrick Henry, this is in 1796, reflecting back, he says, none of those guys' writings amounted to the destruction of Christianity at all. He said, "These have been confuted and their fame is decaying, insomuch that the puny efforts of Thomas Paine are thrown in to prop their tottering fabric whose foundations cannot stand the test of time." This was just 20 years after Hume died. And he was saying that these guys are almost him and their alike are almost just forgotten now. And they're having to be brought back by popular writers like Thomas Paine, who's living off, by the way, of the fame of this writing that he had to borrow from the Bible largely. If you ever read Common Sense, read it and see how many allusions are over and over. He's got these allusions to, we are the people of Israel and God is going to save us and da-da-da-da-da and all this. So he goes on, he says, amongst other strange things said of me, I hear it is said by the deists that I am one of their number, and indeed that some good people think I am no Christian. This thought gives me much more pain than the appellation of Tory. He said, if you would call me a guy who was actually a British guy, that would be better than actually calling me a deist. I hate deism. That's basically what he's saying. Because I think religion of infinitely higher importance than politics, and I find much cause to reproach myself that I have been so long and have given no decided or public proofs of my being a Christian. But indeed, my dear child, this is a character which I prize far above all this world has or can boast. He said, I should have done more to prevent people from actually thinking that I'd ever be able to be called a deist. Samuel Adams, most people know him because of beer. And do you know he was called the last Puritan because of his opposition to a theater in Boston? A theater, you know. I mean, he was like, no, this is going to bring some junk down on us. We don't need to have this. If he could see Boston today, he'd move back down here to Valdosta. But I went to Boston a couple of years ago with my brother, a few years ago, and man, that theater expanded. I mean, Sam Adams was right on the money there. But it's very interesting. His grandmother, Maria Fifield, was the granddaughter. His grandmother, y'all follow this chart now. I need a map. His grandmother was the granddaughter of John Cotton, the minister who preached the farewell sermon to John Winthrop and the first wave of the Puritans who set sail for America in 1730. Maria's father, Increase Mather, and her brother, Cotton Mather, which a lot of people know who that is, were prominent among Puritan ministers who participated in the 1689 rebellion that toppled the royal governor of the New England colonies for raising taxes without an assembly. On his father's side, Samuel was a descendant of Henry Adams, a Puritan farmer who arrived in Boston with 9 children in 1632. I say all that to say that one of the things that whenever you read documentaries or when you read biographies or textbooks or watch a documentary on Sam Adams, they mostly talk about how he goes to bars and taverns and that he had friends in a lot of those areas. And no doubt he did. He apparently didn't see anything wrong with a little alcohol. Maybe a lot. Like John Knox, you know, he locked everybody in that little room and says, we aren't going to leave here till all this is drunk, and he does. And so it's a big Reformed tradition, I have no doubt. But Sam Adams didn't have a problem with that, and they like to emphasize that as if that makes him not a Christian. And you never hear about his Christianity, and you never hear that one of the things that he kept crying out throughout the entire time he was gathering these people in these the Liberty Boys and the committees of correspondence and all these different things that he was instrumental in the founding of our country. And no one can discount the effect that Samuel Adams had. One of the things they don't point out over and over is that he called people to their Puritan roots. Their Puritan roots. And in fact, Sam Adams called for America to get back to the Puritan roots. The Presbyterian influence was so influential, so pronounced that some loyalists referred to the fight for independence as a Presbyterian rebellion. A Presbyterian rebellion. And I've got this article here. I could read some more, but I'm not going to do that. This decidedly Reformed Christian influence was affirmed by John Adams in 1821, reflecting on the founding of our country. He said, I love and revere the memories, and I want y'all to follow this. This isn't very long, but I want you to follow this. This is a great quote. I love and revere the memories of Huss, Wycliffe, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Melanchthon, and other reformers, how much so ever I may differ from them in many theological, metaphysical, and philosophical points. As you justly observe, without their great exertions and severe sufferings, the USA had never existed. That's John Adams. Y'all, that the United States would be a Christian nation was a given from the vast majority of the founding fathers. For many of them, the priority was to be a Protestant Christian nation. It was not a question of whether it was Christian. It was, well, oh, we're going to be a Catholic and be on the side of the Pope or not. John Adams' big fear in the early parts of the Revolution was what confirmed to him in part by the leadership of the Crown and Parliament making a haven for the Catholics in Canada at that time. And again, I'm not here to bash the Catholics and all this stuff. I'm just saying the question of whether the founding of our country would be Christian was never a question. It was, are we going to be Catholic or are we going to be Protestant? Benjamin Rush saw this as the only way to have true freedom for all religions. A nation devoid of religion was nowhere on their radar, as even the ones considered to be the most irreligious used the principles of Christianity to shape the founding ideals and documents of the United States. This is not to say that there weren't ideas floating around. There were. In fact, they were floating around so prominently that France adopted half of them things for their revolution, which I think is actually a more appropriate word for what they did. Ours was a fight for independence. It was very different. It was revolutionary in some senses, but not a revolution when you equate it with what went on in France. What went on in France appalled a lot of the people in the United States. France, instead of promoting Bible societies and everything, during their revolution, they had the cult of reason, which was atheistic, and the cult of the supreme being, which was deistic, fully with that. But France and the later USSR would try that sort of Christian-less revolution, and we saw where both of those kind of ended up. Now, this subject is really huge. As you can see, issues such as the natural theology's origins and impacts on the Puritans and the colonists, the language of natural theology and the founding documents and its relationship with Christianity and deism, the philosophical foundations of the ideas perpetrated on the founding documents. These and more topics deserve entire books to be written about them and stuff. But I hope that my paltry contribution, of which I didn't get to do all of it, settles it for me. It settles it for me, and I certainly am open to some discussion about some of those things that I mentioned at the end that we could talk about.